The early morning sun cut through the mist over the military base, glinting on wet asphalt and polished boots. A young soldier, Alejandro, stood awkwardly at attention, his uniform torn and stained from yesterday's drills. The laughter echoed across the courtyard. She, the civilian inspector, sharp and elegant, pointed at him, her voice tinged with mockery. "Look at this mess," she sneered, the words carried with a cruel precision. The other soldiers turned their heads, some snickering, some avoiding eye contact, sensing the tension but unsure of what to do. Alejandro's shoulders stiffened, not from fear, but from the weight of silent endurance. He met her gaze for a brief instant. No words, just a calm that hinted at a story untold. The camera of imagination lingers on the cracked pavement beneath his boots, the reflections of the base buildings like mirrors of a world where appearances mattered. Alejandro's hand clenched briefly, the faint tremor of restraint showing he felt the sting of injustice, yet understood patience would be his weapon. A subtle question hung in the air. What would he do next? And here the viewer feels the pull. Who is this soldier really, and why does he endure so silently? The scene closes with Alejandro standing alone as the laughter fades, the first rays of light brushing against his face, hinting at the hidden strength within. If you've ever been underestimated, or seen someone rise from silence to power, imagine what happens next. Hours later, the base was quieter, the hum of activity softened by routine. Alejandro walked through the corridors, his boots echoing on polished floors, each step deliberate, measured. He passed the same faces that had mocked him, now indifferent to his presence, unaware that the tides of fortune could turn. The viewer sees the contrast. The soldier mocked, still modest in demeanor, but his eyes carry a quiet promise. Every glance, every slight nod from a junior officer reminds us that respect is earned not in applause, but in action. Alejandro's gaze fixed on a photograph hanging in the commander's office, a reminder of discipline, legacy, and the invisible battles fought behind every uniform. Time stretches, and we feel the weight of anticipation. The narrative pulse quickens. What seems like humiliation now is the foundation for a revelation yet to come. Alejandro is not just enduring. He is planning, observing, and preparing. The viewer is hooked, sensing that every tiny movement, every quiet step, is setting the stage for a moral reversal. The coming clash of expectation versus reality. The chapter closes with Alejandro pausing near the base gates, the wind tousling his hair, a subtle smile hinting at the future. Silence envelopes the scene, yet the air is thick with suspense. He has a story the world has yet to see, one that will rewrite how every soldier and every observer perceives him. The sun had barely risen, casting a cold, sharp light across the training grounds. Alejandro moved with precision, though his uniform was still worn and frayed from yesterday's ridicule. His fellow soldiers whispered behind their hands, casting sidelong glances, some filled with pity, some with mockery. She appeared again, the civilian inspector, this time accompanied by a high-ranking officer whose gaze was sharp, judgmental. "He can barely keep up," she muttered, loud enough for a few nearby soldiers to hear. Alejandro's heart didn't race with anger, but a steady pulse of determination surged beneath his skin. Every sneer, every whisper, was etched into memory. In the shadows of the barracks, he found small moments of solitude, a quiet corner where he could think, plan, and remind himself that status is temporary and patience is power. His eyes scanned the routines of others, their movements predictable. In silence, he began calculating the steps necessary for change. The camera lingers on his face, revealing subtle details. The tension in his jaw, the set of his brow, the glint of pride in his otherwise humble eyes. Every mocked stance, every public humiliation, added weight to his eventual rise. The audience feels the tension. The story isn't just about status. It's about recognition, justice, and unseen strength. By late afternoon, Alejandro had found a quiet strategy. Alone in the armory, he studied maps and protocols, his mind racing faster than his tired body. Every detail of the base, every chain of command, every weakness in perception was recorded silently. Today's humiliation was a seed for tomorrow's authority. A lieutenant approached, unaware of Alejandro's inner storm. "You're still late," he said casually, echoing the morning's critiques. Alejandro responded with nothing but a controlled glance, eyes steady, revealing calm amidst chaos. The lieutenant paused, sensing a quiet fire that hadn't existed before. Outside, the hum of the base continued, soldiers performing drills, officers walking with unchecked pride. Alejandro's footsteps were deliberate, a silent promise that everything would shift. Even the whispering winds seemed to align with his resolve, carrying subtle echoes of destiny. At dusk, Alejandro paused at the base gates, observing the uniformed figures he had once envied and despised. He imagined the moment when the world would recognize the truth. The soldier they ridiculed was more than they ever expected. The camera metaphorically closes in on his clenched fists and quiet smile. The suspense is tangible. Change is imminent, and when it comes, it will be unstoppable. The night had fallen, yet Alejandro's mind refused to rest. The barracks were quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights above casting long shadows across the polished floor. Every whispered word, every snide comment from earlier in the day, played like a sinister rhythm in his mind. The soldiers who mocked him were unaware that their laughter only fueled a storm brewing silently in the heart of a man they underestimated. He walked past the bunks, his boots echoing softly. Each step was deliberate, measured, commanding without words. A younger soldier peeked from the corner, eyes wide with curiosity, sensing something different. Alejandro offered no smile, no comment, only a brief nod that conveyed silent authority. Authority that was still invisible to most, but undeniably present. Outside, the moon reflected off the steel gates, casting elongated silhouettes of patrolling officers. Alejandro lingered there, feeling the weight of expectation and judgment. Every challenge he had faced, every humiliation, had been a test. Now he would channel that invisible power into preparation. His hands brushed over his uniform, frayed from yesterday, a symbol of endurance rather than shame. The camera closes in on Alejandro's face, a mixture of calm determination and restrained fire. The audience feels the silent tension. This is not a story of defeat, but of patience and inevitability. The night whispers secrets, and he is listening, waiting for the moment when the world will finally see what he has become. Morning came with a sharp breeze that rattled the windows of the base. Alejandro moved through the courtyard, noting every gesture, every misstep, every officer's distracted glance. His focus was unshakable, a contrast to the casual arrogance around him. Suddenly, Lieutenant Harris, a seasoned officer who had observed Alejandro for months, approached. "You're not like the others," he said quietly, almost hesitant. "You see things they don't." Alejandro's lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile. Recognition, even from one skeptic, felt like a small victory. Together, they walked along the parade ground. Harris shared subtle insights, overlooked gaps in procedure, weaknesses in the chain of command, small cracks in the armor of the base's hierarchy. Alejandro listened intently, absorbing every word like water on parched soil. Trust, though fragile, began to form. In the background, the other soldiers trained as usual, oblivious to the quiet conspiracy of skill and observation forming before them. Alejandro's eyes scanned the horizon, imagining the future. The same people who laughed at him would soon find themselves facing a commander who understood every detail, every flaw, every hidden potential. The camera pans upward to catch Alejandro silhouetted against the early sunlight, a man who has endured mockery and ridicule yet remains unbroken. The tension is palpable. A storm is quietly gathering, one that will change everything once it breaks. The mess hall buzzed with chatter and clinking utensils, but Alejandro felt a heavy stillness around him. Eyes flicked toward him, some curious, some derisive. The officer who had humiliated him last week now stood across the room. His chest puffed, confidence radiating like armor. Alejandro's hands rested lightly on the table, but every muscle in his body was taut, ready. Laughter broke from a nearby table, cruel, sharp, cutting through the mundane morning routine. Alejandro's jaw clenched, not in anger, but in silent calculation. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone commanded attention. The whispers of other soldiers traveled through the room, a subtle recognition of something brewing beneath his calm exterior. A trainee accidentally dropped a tray nearby, the crash echoing like a gunshot. Alejandro's eyes caught it, not with irritation but with awareness. Every detail mattered. Every mistake could become a lesson. Every observation a weapon for the day. He would no longer be underestimated. He moved past the tables, each step measured. The officer noticed him and smirked, thinking the power dynamic remained unchanged. Little did he know, Alejandro's patience was a quiet storm. The young sergeant they mocked was shaping a command they couldn't yet fathom. Later that day, Alejandro found himself in the training yard. Soldiers ran drills, their movements rigid, robotic, lacking subtlety. Alejandro watched, analyzing, memorizing. His mind traced the patterns of command, noting strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for subtle intervention. Lieutenant Harris joined him again, handing over a stack of reports. "They underestimate you," Harris said softly. "They think a soldier who endures mockery cannot lead." Alejandro's gaze met his, sharp and unwavering. "They will learn," he replied, voice low but firm. As the sun dipped low, Alejandro gave small, precise corrections to the drills. His words were calm, almost understated, but each carried weight. Soldiers adjusted, realizing that this was no ordinary sergeant. There was authority in his restraint, power in his observation. Even the mocking officer paused mid-command, sensing a shift in the energy of the yard. The camera lingers on Alejandro's eyes, sharp, calculating, alive. In the background, shadows lengthened across the field, a visual metaphor for the coming change. He would not confront with anger. He would dismantle the arrogance around him with precision and inevitability. The tension is thick, the audience on edge, feeling every silent pulse of anticipation. Evening fell over the base, and Alejandro remained in the courtyard, walking among the soldiers with deliberate slowness. Every gaze that met his carried subtle curiosity. Whispers passed like electric currents. No one mocked him now, but the memory of their scorn lingered, a shadow over his calm demeanor. From the barracks, the officer who humiliated him watched, arms crossed, smirk fading as he saw Alejandro interact with the younger soldiers. Alejandro spoke softly, correcting posture, offering minor insights into strategy, not out of condescension but out of careful authority. Each word subtly shifted the soldiers' respect toward him. The mocking officer's eyes narrowed, a silent recognition that the balance of influence was changing. Alejandro's patience and humility became weapons far sharper than any sword or salute. He moved through the ranks, a living example that command is earned, not flaunted. A sudden shout from a soldier startled the group, a minor mishap. Alejandro reacted not with anger but with precise guidance, turning embarrassment into instruction. The officer's disbelief grew. This was no ordinary sergeant. He was cultivating loyalty without forcing it, humility as a cloak for power. Morning arrived, casting pale light across the base. Alejandro walked to the training ground, soldiers falling into formation instinctively. Even the mocking officer felt the tension, his authority waning in the face of Alejandro's quiet command. Alejandro spoke once, softly but with clarity. "Positions," he said. His voice carried weight, unshakable, drawing all attention. Soldiers moved with precision, instinctively recognizing the shift in command, even if they could not yet name it. The officer tried to assert dominance, barking orders that clashed with Alejandro's calm corrections. Alejandro's mere presence overshadowed the aggressive tone. Soldiers hesitated, choosing to follow Alejandro's guidance instead. It was subtle, invisible to outsiders, but the undercurrent of power had already shifted. The onlookers could almost feel it, a quiet revolution. Alejandro's humiliation had forged patience, observation, and tactical brilliance. The officer's pride became brittle, cracking under the weight of unspoken truths. The narrative of mockery was dissolving, replaced by anticipation of an impending revelation. By midday, Alejandro's presence had become a subtle magnet. Soldiers lingered nearby, exchanging glances and murmurs, yet no one dared speak too loudly. Even the mocking officer felt eyes on him, the invisible weight of respect pressing against his chest. Alejandro walked past, observing without interruption. His sharp gaze caught minor mistakes and hesitations, not to punish but to guide. Every corrected step, every adjustment, became a silent lesson. The soldiers began to mirror his precision, almost unconsciously. From the corner of the courtyard, the officer's jaw tightened. Alejandro's calm confidence was not loud, not boastful, yet it resonated more than any shouted order. The past humiliation, the laughter, the sneers, had been a crucible forging patience, resilience, and undeniable authority. Even those who had once mocked him found themselves uncertain. How could a man so understated command such respect? Alejandro's aura carried a lesson that no words could encapsulate. Strength hidden beneath humility is more potent than arrogance. That evening, Alejandro orchestrated a surprise drill. Soldiers scrambled, some hesitated, but his presence alone seemed to reorder the chaos. No one could predict his movements, yet everyone followed, compelled by the invisible pull of competence. The mocking officer barked commands, trying to assert control, but his voice was drowned by Alejandro's precise, deliberate actions. The contrast was glaring, confidence born from respect, not fear, overshadowing authority that relied on intimidation. As Alejandro moved across the training ground, soldiers instinctively shifted their attention toward him. Each corrected step, each adjusted stance, became a testament to his growing influence. The whispers grew louder, yet now tinged with admiration rather than ridicule. Alejandro's mind was already planning the next steps. Small gestures that would solidify loyalty and trust, creating a foundation far more powerful than any rank could grant. The day's events left the officer flustered, his pride eroding under the quiet, unstoppable force that Alejandro had become. Alejandro moved silently through the base at dawn, the cold morning mist curling around the edges of the barracks like ghostly fingers. Every step he took resonated, not with noise, but with intent. Soldiers rose to attention instinctively as he passed, their eyes flicking between him and the officer who had once ridiculed him. There was a tension in the air, a current that made every whispered word seem amplified. The officer tried to assert dominance, but even his commands felt hollow, echoing against the invisible barrier of respect Alejandro had quietly constructed. No one laughed anymore. No one dared to. Even those who had been indifferent now followed his gaze, measured each movement, and absorbed every silent lesson he delivered with an unwavering calm. Alejandro paused at the training field, observing young recruits struggling under heavy packs. The sun reflected off damp metal and polished boots, highlighting the contrast between their frantic efforts and his composed stride. His mind catalogued every hesitation, every falter, every flicker of uncertainty, not to punish, but to understand. The subtle weight of authority had 1,000 nuances, and he intended to wield them with precision. A small group of soldiers exchanged glances, realizing that the man they had underestimated held the kind of strength that could not be faked. Alejandro's rise was invisible but undeniable, a tide pulling the morale and loyalty of the base toward him. Each whispered conversation, each cautious glance, cemented his influence without a word, leaving the officer's arrogance increasingly exposed. By midday, the base hummed with an uneasy energy. Alejandro's presence was everywhere and nowhere, an omnipresent force guiding the rhythm of every drill and routine. Soldiers moved with an almost subconscious obedience, their movements smoother, sharper, more confident under his silent watch. The mocking officer barked orders, trying to assert authority. Yet his voice felt distant, dissonant against the growing symphony of respect Alejandro commanded without uttering a single word. Even minor corrections by Alejandro, a tilt of the head, a raised eyebrow, a subtle gesture, reverberated through the ranks like thunder in a quiet valley. A younger recruit, who had once laughed at Alejandro's missteps, now hesitated as he passed, sensing the gravity of the man's silent scrutiny. Each glance Alejandro gave carried weight. Each movement suggested competence. Each quiet smile reassured and commanded loyalty. It was a dance of power invisible to those who had relied on noise and intimidation. By late afternoon, whispers of admiration had replaced the early morning murmurs of mockery. Alejandro's aura reshaped the base, redefining hierarchy not by title but by influence, skill, and quiet confidence. The officer's face, once smug and unchallenged, now revealed cracks of uncertainty. He was witnessing a phenomenon he could neither command nor understand, the ascent of a man who had been invisible yet unstoppable, who now held the respect that no rank alone could confer. Alejandro stood in the middle of the training ground as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt and worn-out equipment. The mocking officer approached, trying to mask unease with his usual bluster, but the words faltered on his tongue. He had been used to obedience, to fear, to the quiet acceptance of his superiority, but Alejandro carried none of that deference. The soldiers around them paused mid-task, eyes darting between the two. There was no clamor, no shouting, only the subtle weight of presence. Alejandro's gaze was steady, calm, almost unnerving. It carried the memory of every insult, every scoff, every private humiliation he had endured. But it did not carry revenge. There was no malice in his eyes, only the unshakable confidence of a man who had survived and transformed his pain into power. "You seem different," the officer muttered, his voice low, almost a question. Alejandro tilted his head slightly, a shadow of a smile brushing his lips. He didn't answer immediately. His silence was louder than any words, reverberating through the assembled soldiers, solidifying his unspoken dominance. The air was heavy with anticipation. Soldiers felt a mix of fear and awe, witnessing the shift in hierarchy that no title could enforce. Alejandro's silent authority spoke louder than any command, reshaping perceptions. The officer realized that no reprimand, no public humiliation, could reach this man anymore. He had become untouchable, respected not out of fear, but because of undeniable strength. By evening, Alejandro's influence was fully visible. The soldiers moved with precision and confidence, responding instinctively to his presence. Each action he observed, each correction he made silently, radiated respect and authority. The officer's attempts to regain control were met with polite, measured obedience, but not loyalty. Loyalty had shifted. A young recruit, previously fearful and clumsy, executed a complex drill flawlessly under Alejandro's silent guidance. The other soldiers noticed and exchanged glances, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Alejandro had not shouted instructions. He had simply observed, adjusted, and inspired. Power, they realized, could manifest without words, without threats. It could manifest in presence alone. The officer, now standing at the edge of the field, felt a growing unease. He had ruled through intimidation, through ridicule, yet this man, who had been mocked and dismissed, now commanded the field without raising his voice. Alejandro's rise was complete, not through confrontation, but through competence, calm, and unyielding dignity. As darkness settled over the base, the subtle glow of lamps and the faint hum of distant vehicles framed Alejandro's silhouette. He was no longer the soldier who had been humiliated. He was the new commander, the embodiment of respect, authority, and silent justice. The officer's face betrayed the realization. He had been defeated not by aggression, but by mastery of self, and the unwavering respect it inspired. The moon rose over the base, casting pale light across the silent parade ground. Alejandro lingered near the edge, recalling the years when his uniform had been tattered, when he had been laughed at, dismissed, treated as invisible. Every scar on his knuckles, every sleepless night, every whispered insult replayed in his mind, not with bitterness, but with the solemn weight of endurance. The officer who had once mocked him strode past, glancing sidelong at Alejandro with a mixture of incredulity and fear. Alejandro's eyes met his for a brief moment, calm, unwavering. In that look lay everything unspoken. The years of hidden struggle, the quiet nights spent planning, the subtle acts that had brought him to this moment. There was no revenge in Alejandro's gaze, only the undeniable presence of a man who had transformed humiliation into authority. The soldiers watched this silent exchange, understanding more in Alejandro's quiet composure than any shouted command could convey. They felt the gravity of the transformation. A man they had once pitted now stood above them in skill, discipline, and leadership. Even the officer, whose pride had been his shield for years, faltered under the weight of Alejandro's calm dominance. Alejandro turned away slowly, walking past the rows of soldiers lined up for inspection. Each step was measured, deliberate, carrying the invisible authority of a man who had earned respect through resilience. The officer's murmured attempt to assert superiority went unheard. The ground itself seemed to acknowledge Alejandro's ascendancy, every shadow stretching toward him as if drawn by his quiet power. By morning, Alejandro's influence was undeniable. Soldiers moved efficiently through drills, responding to his silent corrections with precision. His presence reshaped the cadence of the base. Every motion, every glance, every pause conveyed expectation without the need for words. Those who had once dismissed him now unconsciously mirrored his discipline, his attention to detail, his unshakable calm. The officer, standing at the edge of the training field, struggled to assert himself. Commands felt hollow, attempts at intimidation fell flat. Alejandro's authority was not enforced. It radiated naturally, like gravity, pulling everyone into alignment. The irony was bitter yet inescapable. The man who had been humiliated now commanded attention through competence alone. Alejandro paused beside a new recruit who fumbled during the morning drill. He did not scold. He simply demonstrated, subtly adjusting the recruit's posture and movements. The young soldier mirrored him instinctively, performing flawlessly in the next attempt. A ripple of quiet admiration ran through the ranks. Alejandro's mastery was invisible yet omnipresent, a steady hand guiding without force, shaping behavior through example rather than fear. The officer realized fully that respect had shifted irreversibly. Alejandro's rise was not marked by confrontation or anger, but by calm authority, quiet correction, and the unassailable confidence of a man who had endured and grown beyond the reach of humiliation. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the orderly rows of soldiers, it was clear to all who truly held power. Alejandro was no longer merely a soldier. He was the base's heartbeat, silent yet absolute. Alejandro moved through the base with a quiet authority that spoke louder than any shouted order. Soldiers who had once laughed at his awkward salutes and tattered uniform now fell silent in awe. He did not boast. He did not gloat. He merely walked, each step a testament to endurance, discipline, and patience. The weight of years spent in humiliation had forged a man whose presence alone commanded respect. Even the officer who had mocked him could not conceal the unease in his stance. Alejandro's calm gaze met his, not with anger, but with the certainty of justice long delayed. Every whispered comment, every sideways glance, every suppressed chuckle from the past now felt insignificant compared to the reality standing before them. Alejandro's ascent was not loud. It was undeniable, silent, steady, inevitable. Across the parade ground, Alejandro noticed a young recruit struggling with his formation. Without a word, he adjusted the boy's posture, subtly guiding his shoulders, the tilt of his head. The young soldier's eyes widened in comprehension and admiration. Around them, the entire battalion seemed to shift subtly, absorbing the weight of a new era. Alejandro had become a living symbol, the embodiment of perseverance transformed into authority. The officer's lips tightened. Commands once meant to intimidate now echoed hollowly against Alejandro's composed presence. He realized, too late, that the humiliation he had inflicted had not disappeared. It had grown, twisted into an unyielding force of recognition and respect directed toward the very man he had sought to diminish. The base itself seemed to bend toward Alejandro, acknowledging the quiet supremacy of a man who had endured everything and emerged unshakable. The sun rose over the base, bathing the grounds in a golden light that highlighted every detail: the perfect alignment of soldiers, the gleam of polished boots, the crisp folds of uniforms. Alejandro stood at the center, surveying the battalion with an air of calm triumph. His journey from mocked recruit to commanding officer had been invisible to those who judged him prematurely, but now it was undeniable. The officer who had humiliated him approached hesitantly, every step betraying the weight of long-overlooked consequences. Alejandro's eyes met his one final time, not with vengeance, not with cruelty, but with an almost ethereal patience. The officer lowered his gaze, understanding the magnitude of what had been lost. The chance to shape, to influence, to respect a man who had proven himself in silence. Around them, soldiers exchanged glances, a mix of awe and admiration. Alejandro had not only reclaimed his dignity, he had elevated the entire base, showing that true authority was earned, not demanded. The air was thick with unspoken acknowledgement, the silent, electric respect of those who had witnessed the transformation firsthand. As Alejandro turned toward the main gates, his presence commanding yet understated, he caught the officer's last fleeting glance, a mixture of regret, humility, and grudging recognition. Alejandro's lips curved into the smallest, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement that the past no longer held power over him. The battalion, aligned perfectly under the morning sun, watched him go with unwavering attention. And as he strode past, a quiet thought crossed his mind: how far one can rise when they refuse to be defined by humiliation. Sparkles, if you've been inspired by Alejandro's journey, make sure to like this story and subscribe to witness more incredible tales of resilience and transformation.